An ordinary-looking bloke. Someone pointed him out to me in the pub. He looked even less like my idea of a professional croc shooter than the others had, except that he was barefooted. There was no big knife hanging on his belt, no rifle leaning on the bar beside him, no big scars or missing arms or legs, just an ordinary-looking bloke with hair a little longer than most people's. I hate asking people for things, especially strangers, but the missus threatened to ask him herself. So I went up to him and asked if me and the wife could go on a croc shooting trip with him. He was quite happy to take us, but we couldn't tell that at first. He was a Czechoslovakian or Yugoslavian or something, and it was hard to tell what he was saying or thinking. He'd been croc shooting here for 10 years and talked as though he'd learned English from a book, but hadn't been able to practice his conversation much because of being in the bush all the time. He pulled faces to help him get the words out, and it was quite flattering to have someone go to such a lot of troubles to tell you something. I think he still thought in his native language, because you'd often see him just going to say something, and then there'd be a pause for concentration while he worked it out in English before saying it. He'd been mostly in the company of men and had a pretty thorough grounding in bad language, but he was too polite to make use of it. When there was a woman around, he hardly ever spoke. It gave us the impression that he was surly and unfriendly at first, but he was only kind of washing out his vocabulary and hanging it up to dry. After a day or so, he talked quite freely, and we had many long, interesting discussions with him. I remember Darcy's outback appearance, and how I learned later that my imagined croc shooter was as spurious as the water bag hanging on the front of our Land Rover. Darcy was real outback and carried his water in a 44-gallon drum. I wanted to take the water bag off the Land Rover when I discovered how paltry it was, but Fife wouldn't hear of it, and it stayed there as a reminder of the time when we planned to travel the Gulf from one end to the other with one water bag of water. Darcy had the big Blitz army truck loaded with sacks and drums and boxes. Except for a frail-looking plywood dinghy, the whole load looked as though it was ready to be taken to a rubbish dump and tipped off. He also had a big young dog called Crocodile that you couldn't tell the breed of. Darcy wrote the name out for me, so I know it's right, but it sounds more like Proshkovitz. The dog rode in the cab beside Darcy and felt the same way about the Blitz as Fifth did about our Land Rover. Proshkovitz waited outside the pub for Darcy and looked after the Blitz. All the other dogs wandered in and out of the bar, but Darcy told us his dog didn't drink because one of them had to stay sober to see that they got back to camp all right. I asked Darcy what Proshkovitz meant, but he wouldn't say in front of Fifth, and I always forgot to ask him when she wasn't there. It must have been something pretty shocking, because Darcy came out with some real rippers at times and didn't seem to mind Fifth hearing, though he never indulged in ordinary swearing when she was around, more than I can say for myself. The day we first met Darcy, he was going to the Nicholson River and said for us to follow him. It was about 80 miles. He had one or two things to do first, like leaving the bar and getting into his truck and driving off. He already had his drums of petrol and bags of salt and supplies loaded, but he doddered around till I was just about frantic. His casual attitude to croc shooting and his reluctance to get started were comforting in a way, and I was already beginning to have a bit of confidence in him. He was certainly not a show-off, but after all the looking forward to we'd done, all the miles we'd traveled, and all the stories we'd heard, it was hard not to be impatient. When he finally cranked his blitz and drove off along the dirt road, I couldn't help crowding. We followed in a great deluge of dust right under the tailboard of the rattling blitz. 2 hours on the road and half an hour across the plain, and we arrived at the Nicholson. We parked the vehicles on the bank of the green deep river among Mitchell grass and trailing paper barks. It was a real crocodile place, with dark, mysterious corners under the banks and leaning trees. I began to feel like a real croc shooter. We began to unload the gear. Now that we were actually there, I was no longer impatient. We were at last going to shoot crocodiles, or at least see them shot. But Darcy's gear, even Fifth noticed I'd had misgivings about the little boat that we easily lifted off the back of the blitz and slid down the bank to shallow water, to let the cracks soak tight so it wouldn't leak so much. But that was nothing. He got out 2 rusty rifles, a .303 and a .22, that you could hardly work the clogged bolts off. He leaned them against a tree, and one of them fell in the dirt and stayed there till I picked it up and sneaked a look at it. I'd seen a few rifles in my time, but I'd never known one fired in such a neglected condition as that .303. He got out a knife and stuck it in the ground beside the rifles. It was sharp enough, but alarmingly small for such enormous, ferocious things as the crocodiles we'd heard about. Then a spotlight about the size of a torch head that fitted on his forehead with an elastic strap and ran off the blitz battery. It was pale and flickery just to look at, and it was hard not to offer to fix it for him. There was nothing really wrong with it, just neglect. Then Darcy went into the trees and changed into his working clothes, a kind of baggy napkin he tied round his waist with a piece of shreddy rope. It looked like a length of faded, gaily colored chair cover. Biff identified it in whispers as a piece of curtain material. You could tell he was used to wearing it because of the way it fitted his sunburn. He wasn't a big man or a small one. He stood about 5'10" and had wiry, jumpy muscles in his back and arms. He had long blonde hair and was somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. It was hard to tell, but there was no mistake about him being fit and hard. There was a kind of economy about him that was a lot less inspiring in his gear than it was in Darcy. Biff lit the fire in the best place and began making a damper to go with the billy of tea that was coming up. Darcy threw a heap of rope off his truck and began to untangle it. I saw there was a rusty iron shaft about 8 inches or of 3/4 mild steel with a big flat barbed point at one end. The rope Darcy was shaking loops and knots out of was spliced to a ring at the middle of this thing. Darcy looked up at me watching. If you are going to be a croc shooter, you should be understanding this. It is my harpoon. I tried to look as interested as I was, and he went over to the blitz and got a long straight pole out from under all the stuff that cluttered the tray. It was about 15 feet long and had a sharp hook bound to the thin end. This hook is to bring a dead croc off the bottom in shallow water, he explained. When you kill a croc, he sinks quickly to the bottom. That is why you must be coming very close to him before you shoot, and very quick to snatch his leg or snout afterwards. What if they are not properly dead? I asked. In all things you must use your sense, he replied. But when you have a big bloke in deep water, you will lose him if you shoot him, because you cannot get him to your boat or even hold him up from sinking, so you must use your harpoon. There are many kinds of harpoon, but this one is good enough for me." He picked up the iron quill and tried to fit the smooth end of the shaft into a hole in the thick end of the pole, but it was clogged with mud where he'd been pulling his dinghy away from banks or something. He began to dig it clear with a piece of stick. This fits into the hole and is sliding out when you stick the croc in the neck. That is the best place to strike him. Then you will have him on the end of your rope, and you have only to wait your chance to shoot him. He fitted the quill into the end of the pole, and demonstrated how it worked by stabbing the quill lightly onto a log. It was a very simple and effective-looking device, exciting. That is the theory, and it works most of the time. There are many interesting variations, and you must be prepared for it to go wrong, he said. Doesn't a croc attack the boat when you stick that thing into him? Not usually, or I would not be here, but a croc could be easily breaking your boat by accident when he flicks his tail or head trying to get away. His main thought is to escape into deep water when he is attacked. Have you ever had a croc smash your boat or attack you? I asked. No, only once I had an accident with my harpoon. The quill would not come free from the pole, and the croc swung the pole around and was knocking me from the boat. It looked as though Darcy was going to leave the story at that, so I said, "What happened?" "I went into the water and got quickly back into my boat," he said. "Did you get the croc?" "Yes, but I lost my light and had to come 300 miles to get another one." "Don't you carry a spare light?" I couldn't help asking. "If I had looked after my harpoon correctly, I would not have needed a spare light," he said. Hell. While we were having pannikins of tea and chunks of fresh damper, Fifth asked Darcy if he often taught people how to be croc shooters. "Many people come with me because they are so curious about crocodiles. Not many of them come 2 times, and most of them I do not like." "What do you do? Kick them out?" asked Fifth, embarrassingly. "No," said Darcy, "there is no need for me to be sending them away. There are places where I can take them that only a good man or crocodile can live in." "Will you take us to a place like that when you're tired of us?" asked Fifth earnestly. "No," said Darcy, "your husband is not a sightseer." "He wants to be a crocodile shooter, so I will teach him. When he is ready, he will not be happy to remain with me. He will go away to rivers to try out his new knowledge." "How long will it take, Darcy?" "You could shoot crocodiles for many years and still know nothing about them. One man can learn more in one instant than another learns in a lifetime. But when will we be proper croc shooters?" insisted Fifth. "As soon as you shoot a crocodile," replied Darcy. And that was all he'd say about it. He was a hard man to understand, but the more we saw of him and spoke to him, the more convinced I was that he was a man who knew what he was doing. Only the gear of his had me puzzled. It was many weeks before I began to understand. It was reassuring to learn that Darcy was mainly interested in the smaller freshwater crocodiles at the moment. Johnson River crocodiles, they are called, grow to about 10 feet and aren't dangerous to swimming humans. They eat fish mostly, but will have a go at anything that's lying around and can be grabbed. They'd give you a very nasty bite if you mishandled one. I was quite happy to start on the little ones. There was the odd big salty and the Nicholson, but Darcy wasn't expecting to get onto them. "We will make a lot of noise getting the freshies," he explained. Darcy and I hung mosquito nets for later, and as the evening was drawing close, we prepared the dinghy for shooting that night, or rather Darcy did. I just watched and passed him things. He bailed the water out of the dinghy and jammed the milk tin bailer under the middle seat. Then he folded sacks on the seats and laid the rifles loaded and ready on them, so that there's no knocking on the wood of the boat when I pick up a rifle to shoot. Then he coiled the harpoon rope neatly in the bow and stuck the quill ready in the crack between the front seat and the side of the dinghy. The knife he put in the opposite crack, a big hatchet on a sack in the bottom of the boat. Then I passed him the battery out of the blitz, which he put under the front seat, ready to clip the spotlight onto. The harpoon pole laid along the boat and sticking out over the back. Crock box under the back seat with spare ammunition, light bulbs, torch, mosquito repellent, matches, and odds and ends. And the big handmade paddle Darcy used instead of oars or outboard motor. A plastic jar of water from the big drum on Darcy's truck. The river here was tidal and salty, though there was no sign of any current. The little dinghy looked small and overloaded already. It was nearly dark, a feed of something or other, a pannikin of tea. Darcy lights his carbide light so we can find the place where we come back. Proshkowzik is told to look after the camp and goes to sit importantly by the blitz. Of course, your wife can come. Why not? The first stars and mosquitoes. Better wear long sleeves and pants. It might get cold later. The birds are quiet. A splash out in the river. Frogs croak. Got the tobacco? It's time. Biff and me on the back seat. Darcy in the bow. He pushes us away from the bank with the paddle and fixes the light over his lumpy old hat. Out on the still river, the dinghy turns slowly on black solid water. Hell, it's small. Why doesn't he have a bigger boat? The light spears out across the river and rakes the banks on the other side up and down, which is upstream anyway. Then he picks up the middle paddle and begins to pull us along with big easy strokes. Not a ripple or a swirl, 2 strokes on one side, 2 on the other. It's like sliding through space. The thin brilliance of the spotlight poking its finger into the black corners of the overhanging river, and the speed only evident from the sliding of the flanking trees across the stars. Too fast to be going into something that should be tackled with caution and preparation. It was like being forced into a decision. I would have liked just to sit in the dinghy for a while to get used to the atmosphere. Hundreds of fish swirling suddenly and light away from the dinghy, sloshing loudly out in the dark. Noises around us, the whump 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 of a wallaby, frightened enough to run and curious enough to stay, comprising by bounding along the bank. Yippings, chirkings, raspings, and crackings. The light flicks back to a place it's just swept past, and there are the unmistakable eyes of a crocodile, brilliantly red in all that vast lack of color, no horny head or curved tail, not even the eyes themselves, just a blaze of red smoldering in the reeds at the far bank. The dinghy glides over the distance towards the unblinking stare at the end of the light, Darcy leaning forward in the bow of our headlong dinghy without a falter in the dip and switch of the big paddle. Closer right up to the thing, Darcy steers expertly with the paddle in one hand and picks up the .22 with the other. Still, the eyes are all you could see. Darcy lays the paddle across his knees and raises the rifle. His shoulder blots out the sight of the croc's eyes. We must be nearly on top of it. All of a sudden, the anticipation of this moment becomes a bellyful of reluctance. I lean back in the seat and clutch at the side of the dinghy. Then a shot, a glimpse of a white belly floating in the light. Darcy hooks under it with the edge of the paddle as it begins to sink and grabs it by the snout. He pulls its head over the side of the boat and reaches to grope for the hatchet. 2 chops behind the head sever its spine. He passes his grip round the jaws back along the gunwale to me. My hand takes a twitching, nervous grip on the cold snout. I lift it in 2 heaves over the side of the dinghy and lay it out in the bottom of the boat. A 6-foot freshie, I kept reaching down in the dark to feel the cold scales of my first crocodile while Darcy rolled a smoke and spoke quietly to us about where we might pick up another 1 or 2. Fife told me she wasn't scared because of me being there, just a little nervous about the suddenness of the noises because of it being so dark. Hell, a mile or so further up the river we got 2 more freshies and heard what Darcy said was a big bloke crash down a bank ahead into the water with a splash as though the world had fallen in. Then we came to a place where the river had dried up. We had to get out and drag the boat through 100 yards of mud and shallow water to where the river was deep again. Darcy said that most of these rivers dried up into a series of long lagoons in the dry season. We got 6 freshies altogether that night, all in pretty much the same style as the first one. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning when we arrived back at the place where Darcy's carbide light was flickering weakly on the bank to mark our camp. Pushkowick came over to report that all was well and to have a look at our crocks. We had mugs of tea and slices of Yaloginda bread, then crawled into our swags under the mosquito nets. Fife snuggled happily around inside my arm till we were warm and comfortable. Then she whispered one of our special sayings and went to sleep. I lay there for a while thinking about croc shooting. I'd been hunting things like pigs and deer and kangaroos ever since I was old enough to pinch my old man's rifle when he was away. But this was like no hunting I'd ever imagined. Wait till we got stuck into some of those big blokes of Darcy's. What a strange bloke he was, a real croc shooter. In the morning Darcy showed Fife and me how to open up the crocs, skin them, and scrape and salt the skins. He told us that hornbacks are different from belly skins and not worth quite so much, that the salting and storing are very important. I wanted to pitch in and have a go at it, but he said I'd get plenty of practice later, and the best thing to do for the time being was just watch. It took him about 2.5 hours to skin and scrape and salt the 6 crocs we got the night before, explaining everything as he went. After lunch we loaded everything on and into the vehicles, crossed the Nicholson at the dried up ford a mile downstream, and drove for a couple of hours cross country to a sandy river, where Darcy said we should get quite a lot of freshies. We camped on a sloping bank at the end of the line of rocks across a dry part of the river. Darcy and I went out that night and got 13. 2 of them were stuffers, only a year or two old. A stuffer is anything from 9 inches to a couple of feet long. You drift the dinghy right up to them, grab them hard and quick around the neck, and put them in the sack in the bottom of the boat. Careful to tie the top of the sack because, even at that age, they can give you a nasty bite. Darcy skinned them in a special way and cured the hide and head with salt and mounted them. He made a very professional looking job of them too. Sold them for 3 bob an inch to people round the Gulf or travelers. I was surprised that he wasn't using arsenic or something to cure his stuffer skins, but he said the first ones he ever did 7 years before were as good as the day he finished them. He later taught Fife how to do them, and she became as good at it as Darcy himself. I was going to have a go at the skinning this time, and I was up at dawn, knife like a razor, ready to get started. I learned something that day, the disgrace of cutting a hole in my first skin, and the next, nervous of Darcy's disapproval, bellies and hornbacks. Any crocodile less than 16 inches across the belly is a hornback. Open it up down the belly to the tip of the tail and square under the legs like Darcy showed us. Open the belly skins above the second row of buttons, high on each side down to the top of the tail and down the top of the legs. Keep them square, knife it off carefully all the way. Watch it round the legs and under the jaw. Every knife cut can cost you a quid. You should use your knife a little blunt until you learn the feel of it, said Darcy kindly. You can scrape off meat, but you cannot mend cuts in the hide. Darcy used 2 knives, a little straight one for opening up, and a big curved one for knifing off, of which he used only the tip, holding it like a fountain pen. The dinghy upside down in the shade. Never let the sunlight shine on your skins, or they will get scale slip. With Fife up to her knees at the edge of the river, scraping the meat off the skins with a thing like a big sharp fish scaler. The flesh is white, like tough fish. Darcy's eaten it and says any meat is the best you can get if you can't get anything else. Proshkowick won't look at it, even cooked. Don't blame him. Give Fife a spell with the scraping. There's only 3 left to skin. She's just mucking around down there. Only done 2. Hell, but it's tough going. Harder work than the skinning. Poor old Fife must have had it. Look at her sitting on the bank, trying not to show it. Make us a billy of tea, Mum. Scraping, scraping, try and keep it vigorous. It comes off easier that way, like scrubbing. Drift back into pulling at the meat as though the scraper's a hairbrush till you notice you're not getting anywhere, and rip into it again as long as you can keep it up. Get the file out of the Land Rover and sharpen the scraper, you fool. It's blunt. Take your time while your arm has a rest from the scraping. Notice how the edge has been filed at an angle on one side and left flat on the other. Follow that till your arm gets tired from filing and back to scraping. A bit easier, but you've cut a nick in the skin with the scraper. It's too sharp now. Take a bit off the edge on this rock. Get on with the scraping. Try using your left hand. No good. Got one finished. Wash the bits of meat off it and throw it into the shallow water near the ones that haven't been done yet. Next one. Sweat and hair in a man's eyes. Darcy's nearly finished skinning the last one. A pannikin of tea and a smoke. I'll scrape the rest while you do the salting, if you like, Darcy. What the hell are you saying? But Darcy takes a turn at the scraping and makes it look easy. You do the next one. There must be an easier way of doing it. Wire brush, a blade, and a thing like a safety razor so you won't cut the skin. Scraping the skin over a blade bolted on to the blitz. Try cooking it off. Ants? No, just keep on scraping. There, all done. Arm on fire and the back like a shearer. Now the salting. Spread them out on the grass in the shade, biggest on the bottom. Dig handfuls of fine salt out of the bag with cut stinging and spread it on. But put plenty on. Salt's cheap compared to croc skins. At 6 and 6 an inch across the widest part. Make sure to rub it well into all the folds and edges. Scatter a couple of double handfuls over it for good measure, and lay the next biggest skin on the top. Same again. Fold the belly flaps and legs in and roll them up from the head in the way Darcy does. Keep the salt in. Get Fife to hold the sack and pack them in. Throw a couple of handfuls of spilt salt on each layer. Put the sack on the blitz and cover it with more sacks for extra shade. Hell, they are heavy. Darcy has been watching and nods approvingly. You will not be difficult to teach, he said, because you are anxious to learn. What's the time? 1 o'clock. Flop on the swag beside Fife and roll smoke. Darcy might decide not to go out tonight. A flaming joker's got to rest sometime. None of those expert croc shooters we met on the way up here said anything about scraping the skins. Shooting them's the easy part. Have a feed and a couple of hours rest under the mosquito net, away from the flies. Read up on Fife's diary and correct the spelling, then start prowling around the camp. Make sure everything's ready to be got ready for shooting that night. Roshkovitz. We stayed 4 days at the Sandy River and got 41 croc skins there. Then we headed off across the shimmering plain and cast out among scattered bush till we found a little lagoon Darcy knew about. 50 yards long and 20 across in a green circle of trees. Darcy said we should get 15 or 20 freshies there before we went back to Yaloginda to send the skins away. The water looked muddy enough to walk on, but what we'd been drinking was brackish and rusty. We saw about half a dozen crocs surface while we were looking for a place to camp. I was surprised how easy it was going to be to get them in such a small body of water. I had another surprise coming. We lit a fire at the edge of the water at the shallow end of the waterhole and slung the mosquito nets under a big forked paperback that Fifth discovered was good to sit in. Darcy got his old radio hooked up to the Land Rover. Battery, and Fifth made friends with a little waving hand lizard that came to listen. Darcy got a 4-inch gill net out of the confusion on the blitz, and we strung it across the center of the lagoon. Once a crocodile touches a net, his teeth are caught, and he rolls up in it and drowns himself. Proshkovitz found a big yellow goanna under a log and grabbed it by the tail. He got a badly bitten nose out of the encounter, and Darcy got the goanna ready for stuffing. That night we shone the spotlight round the lagoon and lit up eyes like the lights of a city. I reckon there must have been about 50 crocs there, but Darcy said 25. It was a great sight all the same. We paddled around the lagoon for 2 hours, but the croc wouldn't let us get near them. There was a deep rumbling in the water that Darcy said was the crocs roaring underwater. We shot 5, but they all sank before we could reach them. The lagoon was far too deep for us to reach the bottom with a pole. It was very flattening. We went back to the camp to make plans. The best way to get those crocs, Darcy said, was to shoot them and wait till they floated to the surface. It takes a few days depending on the deepness and on the temperature of the water. If we get to them quickly when they rise to the surface, we can save the skins, but we must be careful not to leave dead crocs floating in the waterhole, because it could make us unfavorable with the station manager, who might be refusing his permission for us to shoot crocodiles across his country. Next morning we pulled in the net. There were only 2 small crocs in it, and 2 beautiful big barramundi. Good eating too. Even Darcy was surprised to find these aristocratic fish in such a muddy little lagoon. One of the crocs wrapped the net around a stake, and we had to tear it free to get out. So Darcy told me to go down the lagoon and see how many crocs I could shoot while he mended the net. Count please how many you kill, so we can expect that many to arise later to be skinned, he said. I must have looked a bit silly, dashing around with the light. I'd been bursting to try out my .222 rifle and scope on the crocs. This was just the opportunity. I found a good ambush on the bank, and by that night I'd shot 13 crocs I was sure of, and 3 I wasn't. They weren't lying on the surface anymore. It doesn't take them long to wake up. They'd come up 2 little green ridges of eyes and snout, just long enough to get a breath. Then they'd go down again without a ripple. You'd have to be quick to get a shot in, and they come up in the most unexpected places. If they surfaced in one place without being shot at, they'd try it a second time. Otherwise, they shifted around all over the place. I never actually saw one surface. They're so subtle about it, they just appear and vanish again like impressions. 15 minutes seemed to be roughly the time they'd stayed under, but Darcy said it varies with the size and age of the crocs, from a few minutes for the little freshies to an hour or more for a big old salty. It's less, though, if they are wounded or very excited. It was a good opportunity to study the crocs at close hand, and I learned a lot about them that day. This method of shooting may look a bit callous. Well, I've shot thousands of roos and deers and pigs, and I still always get annoyed at wounding one and do my best to track it down and finish it off. But I've never heard of anyone feeling like that about a crocodile. There's something about them you can't feel sorry for them. There's something evil about them. The next day, Darcy told me that if you shoot any croc in the end of the nose and hit the valve there, it can't stay under the water or it drowns. It has to come out on the bank, the same as crocs that are sick or badly wounded. So I was to try and nose shoot the ones I'd missed the day before. We didn't want to have to wait around too long for crocs to float to the surface. I sat up in a tree this day because it was a better angle to shoot from and the crocs couldn't see where I was. Any movement on the bank is silhouetted against a background of sky in that flat country, and a croc has incredible eyesight. My targets were no bigger than a sixpence perched on the end of a croc's nose. I missed a lot of shots, but when I did hit one, it was quite spectacular. The croc would disappear in the splash, the same as a miss, but after a few seconds he'd come periscoping to the surface and thrash round and round the lagoon and then climb out onto the bank. I'd yell out to Darcy, who'd come paddling down in the dinghy and finish it off with his .22, which didn't go off sometimes. Occasionally I'd only nick the croc's nose and he'd dive and bury his head in the mud on the bottom of the lagoon. Then, just when I'd give him up, he'd come thrashing up. Then he'd dive again, just as Darcy got there with the harpoon. Then, just as Darcy was leaving, he'd come bursting up again, and they'd chase each other round and round till Darcy got a quill into the croc. And don't they snap at that rope! I'd hate to have even a fresh bee attack me in the water. A man wouldn't stand a chance. Darcy has a theory that the only reason freshwater crocodiles aren't dangerous to humans could be that they don't grow big enough. A salty up to 10 feet long isn't dangerous to humans or cattle either, usually. It was days before the dead croc started floating up, but fun waiting. Let's have a discussion, Fifth would say when there wasn't much doing. What will we discuss about? Darcy would ask. Tell us about rivers, Fifth would say. And Darcy would tell us about the Roper, or the Lemon, or some other river he'd crocked in. He'd spent 2 years at some foreign university before the war loosed things up for him. He was carted away to be a soldier when he was 17. I don't know whose side he was on, but he had a job leading patrols and taking prisoners, as far as I can make out from what he'd say about it. Apparently he was wounded and captured a couple of times. Then he deserted and was court-martialed and let off instead of getting a medal for something brave he'd done. In the 10 years he'd been in the Gulf, he'd learned more about Australia than we knew. In a lot of ways, makes a man think. Anyway, we always ran out of time before we ran out of things to say, and we always ended up on croc shooting. We never found out what actually started Darcy on croc shooting, but he'd been on his own most of the time. He'd had mates from time to time, but apparently they'd been unable to stand the solitude as well as Darcy and had gone off to take jobs closer to civilization and other people. One bloke had left him up on the Cape York Peninsula and taken 400 croc skins into town to sell. That was the last Darcy ever heard of him. During one of these discussions, Darcy told us how some of the Mayo Aborigines in Arnhem Land crossed the rivers. When families of Abos on walkabout have to cross a river, they stop half a mile before they get to it, and have a breather and sort themselves out. Then they run to the river, dive straight in, and swim across. The oldest and weakest get left behind, and are the only ones left in the water by the time any crocs around get into action. A croc will nearly always take the last horse or cow or person in a bunch. It's a handy way to weed out the weak, but I wouldn't like to be an old Abo, or come to think of it, it wouldn't be so bad at that. At least they don't kick you out of the family as a reward for growing old, and leave you to die among strangers, like we do. And Abbo knows what to expect and why to expect it. There's nothing personal about it. Darcy told us, too, about an 18-foot croc parading up and down in the river in front of a black's camp with a screaming girl held in his jaws, ducking her under every now and again, and then holding her up, kicking and screaming again. When the croc got tired of this, it closed its jaw and sank. The last they saw of the girl, she was sinking slowly into the spreading stain of her own blood. That story kept me quiet for a bit. Then I asked Darcy, "Why didn't you shoot the croc?" "I could not have hit the croc without the danger of hitting the girl," he replied, and my eyes were almost blinded by what they were seeing. That had happened nearly 6 years ago, before, when Darcy had been trapped by the wet season for 3 months and was initiated into a tribe of natives on the Arnhem Land River. Proshkovitz always joined us when we were talking, and listened politely with his eyes to whoever was speaking. He never got in the way, though, because he was a dog, and dogs who interrupt the boss when he's talking get sent to sit under the blitz, like a small boy being sent to bed. Fifth and I were just beginning to realize how good a dog Proshkovitz was. We didn't notice at first because of him being so polite, and Darcy never bragged about him or anything. No snake could come near or camp without Proshkovitz warning us. I think he actually used to patrol them. He became especially protective about Fifth, and whenever she left the camp or went for a swim, Proshkovitz would go importantly first and watch all the time for dangers, real or suspected. Darcy didn't mind his dog spending so much time with Fifth. He encouraged it. I'll always remember him saying, "The greatest pleasure for my dog is looking after his people." And the greater the responsibility, the greater is his pleasure. He is better at looking after your wife than we are, because you see he is never thinking of other things. For Proshkovitz, a world full of dangers is the best kind of world. When he has no one to protect, a dog is only half a dog. I took Proshkovitz hunting pigs one afternoon, and we caught a monstrous old sow, which I hung in a tree so we could pick up the meat the next day if we wanted. Then I got lost on the flat plain and couldn't find my way back to the lagoon. Proshkovitz and I had a bit of an argument about which direction it was in, and I won. We found the wheel marks of the Land Rover and Blitz in the long grass and followed them in the moonlight for a couple of miles, till I saw by the tire treads of the Rover on a clay plan that we were going in the wrong direction. Proshkovitz, who'd been walking behind, took over and marched in front as soon as I started going the right way. When we got back to camp, I told Darcy and Fifth we'd got onto a pig that took us a long time to catch and kill. It wasn't worth mentioning anything to them about being lost, especially Fifth. She has a stubborn belief that I can do anything. The next day we went in the Land Rover to get the pig I'd hung in the tree, and it took us a hell of a time to find it. All that country looks the same. We salted about 40 pounds of pork, but never got to try any of it. It was flogged off the back of Darcy's Blitz by some ringers when we and they were coincidentally in Yaloginda a week later. On another little walkabout, I was going for a stroll in the moonlight when Proshkovitz started barking his "come and have a look at this" bark in the distance. I had no rifle with me, nor even a knife, but it was a fair way back to camp. I ran towards the barking, picking up a good hefty lump of wood on the way. It might only be a goanna in a tree. Proshkovitz was running round and round a 6-foot croc in the mud at the dried-up end of a shallow waterhole. I won't go into details, but I managed to kill the croc with my lump of wood in the finish. I strolled back into camp with it over my shoulder and casually dumped it by the water to be skinned next morning. Fifth and Darcy were both waiting for me to tell them how I'd caught a big freshie with my bare hands, but I nonchalantly talked about other things as though nothing had happened. I felt a bit lousy about cheating Brushkovitz out of his rightful share of credit in the affair, so I confessed some of the details to Fifth. She called me an old lizard skinner, and we had a happy afternoon planning what might be going to happen. I later overheard Darcy telling them in the Yaloginda pub about me catching a 6-footer with obvious pride. Darcy doesn't know how to whisper. The dead crocs started coming to the surface of the lagoon in 2s and 3s, and we were kept fairly busy skinning and scraping for a day or two. When we reckoned we got most of them, Darcy decided we should take our skins to Yaloginda. It was getting to moonlight for spotlighting crocs effectively anyway. So we headed across country in a direction that only Darcy knew. Just before the dirt road that led to the Nicholson River crossing, Darcy's Blitz dropped its front wheels into a hollow in the grass and plunged its nose into a bank as though it was trying to blow it. There was no damage done, but his motor had stalled. Darcy never used the self-starter because he was always saving the battery for spotlighting, and his starter motor had seized up. I tried to pull him out backwards with the Land Rover, but couldn't budge him. It became a decision whether it would be less trouble to take the starter off and free it, or dig a space in the bank so we could use the crank handle. We decided to do both in case one didn't work. I dug, and Darcy undid the starter, unclogged it, and put it back on again. We both finished at the same time and used the crank handle because Darcy hated wasting battery power. He backed out of the hole with a great roaring and jouncing and skidding, and we carried on. When we arrived at the Nicholson crossing, the tide was in, and the water had backed up chest deep. There was nothing to do but wait for it to go out again. We backed the vehicles into the shade of trees and had a brew of tea and cold barramundi on Fifth's camp oven bread. Fifth was still sad about our Land Rover not being able to pull Darcy's Blitz out of that hole, so I cheered her up a bit by making a slight adjustment to what I said was a slipped timing cog in the transmission case, and told her it was a wonder the Rover went at all with that not working properly. Putting the Land Rover into 4-wheel drive or low reduction as the most exciting thing that could happen to Fifth all day. Though she hadn't the vaguest idea what it was all about, the low reduction lever was a kind of magic wand that enabled the Land Rover to perform miracles of traction and stability. 4-wheel drive, dear, she'd say whenever we came to a rough enough stretch of road for it to be even remotely necessary. And if I was in the mood for it, I'd make a great display of having to use the 4-wheel drive and spin the steering wheel urgently back and forth to make it look right. Crossing open country would have her bobbing up and down on the seat like a wallaby in a rabbit trap. Low reduction, dear, she'd say, when I spun the wheels through a wet patch on purpose. Make us go through there, dear, be careful. There's a nice place. I wonder if we'll have to go up that bank through all the long grass by that log. And crossing a river or creek where the fan belt had to be taken off and water came in the doors was something she'd still be talking about when we got to wherever we were going. The Land Rover was our only really important possession, and I was careful not to knock it around too much and kept it in perfectly fair condition. I carried plenty of spare everything I could think of, and every new part I put in it was an addition. As far as Fifth was concerned, not a replacement. God knows what would have happened if we'd had an accident and written the thing off. All the insurance companies in the world couldn't compensate Fifth for the loss of our Land Rover. It was a bit of a worry. Darcy dozed under the Blitz, and Fifth and I went for a swim in the ford with no clothes on. I kept teasing her that Darcy was coming, and she'd squeal and try to hold hands in front of her 33.5, 24, 33, all at once. She's as funny as a little monkey's when she's embarrassed. The tide stayed in all day, and Darcy woke up for long enough to explain that in the Gulf the tide could stay in or out for days because of the wind and the shallowness of the water. He'd seen 3 high tides in the MacArthur in one afternoon, so we waited. After a feed that night, Fifth and I crawled into our swag, tired from swimming, while Darcy went on watch to keep an eye on the tide. He woke us up about midnight. The river was low enough to sneak across if we were careful, but it had started rising again, so we'd have to hurry. We drove across without anything worse happening than our feet getting wet and camped again on the other side. Darcy said that Yaloginda would have to wait for daylight, so it might as well wait for us too, and he went to sleep on top of his swag with the mosquito net over him. We arrived triumphantly at Yaloginda next day and dumped our bags of croc skins at the store to be sent away. Everybody will be saying, "Here's the croc shooters," said Fifth. We drove along to the pub. There's nothing else to do in Yaloginda except drive along to the pub, or away from it. That's what any croc shooters would have done after a successful trip, so we didn't mind there being nothing else to do. We ordered cans of beer and stood at the bar drinking and yarning about crocs as though we'd been at it all our lives. Fifth kept calling us lizard skinners till I whispered for her to cut it out. We got over 60 croc skins on a very short trip in time as well as distance. You could tell Darcy was pleased with the results, and us. By the way, he told everyone about both. Fifth went along to the little post office to post some letters she'd written and asked Darcy if he had any she could post for him. That was when he told us he didn't know whether he had any relatives left or not.